As Moscow bureau chief for The Economist. He now covers Central and Eastern Europe for that paper. He quite literally wrote the book on the topic before us because he is the author of The New Cold War, How the Kremlin Menaces Both Russia and the West. As you can see, eager to get cracking. Our first speaker against the motion, he is Edward Lucas.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Jonathan, for your kind introduction. And I'm going to leave it to others to deal with this interesting diplomatic and intricate, I should say, diplomatic chronicle that we heard from Professor Pushkov. I would just mention in passing that it is actually Russia which actually has a functioning ABM system, something that that America has not actually yet built. And it is, of course, interesting that the countries around Russia's rim feel so worried about their proximity to Russia that they want to join NATO as soon as possible, and in many cases have already done. Certainly, I believe that more cooperation is possible. Russia actually belongs in what one might call the Greater West. Certainly, the Chinese option with which Mr. Putin flirts so enthusiastically is nonsense. Andrei Pionkovsky, another Russian analyst, referred to it as an alliance between a rabbit and a Birkenstrictor, with Russia playing the role of the rabbit, and any idea that Russia might have a future in a strategic partnership with the Muslim world can be exploded by the simple mention of the word Chechnya. And I will leave it to others to decide how much of Russia's actions since 2001 can be interpreted in the frame of the war in Chechnya rather than in a sincere desire to help America. But let's step back a little bit. I'd like you to indulge me, ladies and gentlemen, with a little thought experiment. Imagine that the Third Reich had not ended on the battlefield in disaster in 1945, but had staggered on for another 40 years. 4 decades in which the Nazi terror had given way to the rule of party hacks who would deplore the excesses of the 1930s and the personality cult of Adolf Hitler, but would remain true to the ideals of National Socialism. And imagine then that in the 1980s, that experiment finally runs out of steam, and the Nazi model of economics developed by Albert Speer just doesn't work anymore. And a reform Nazi, called him Mikhail Gorbach, comes to power. I'm determined to try and save the best of the National Socialist experiment, but to deal with the worst. And he introduces some policies. We might call them Offenheit, or what the Russians would call Glasnost, or we would call openness. And he might have Umbau, which would be perestroika in Russian, or reconstruction in English. But it's a hopeless attempt. National Socialism simply doesn't work anymore. Even the SS and the Gestapo don't really believe in it anymore. And so eventually the Third Reich disintegrates. And long-forgotten nations like the Netherlands and France and Denmark return to the map of the world from which they were erased by the annexation and occupation of 1940. And we get a new country called the German Federation, and we're all very pleased about that, because we want Germany to succeed. And the trouble is that it isn't a great success, at least at the beginning. It's under the rule of a guy who's a bit embarrassing. He's a bit drunken. Call him Boris Yeltsin. And there's a lot of corruption, and it's a pretty unhappy time for many Germans. And there's a lot of dislocation, and the whiff even of disintegration in the air. And then imagine that in 1999, a former SS colonel called Waldemar Pushnik becomes first Prime Minister and then President. Now, we might feel a little bit queasy about that, because we might remember, some of us, or we might have read in history books, that the SS wasn't a terribly nice organization, at least back in the 1930s and 40s. And maybe quite a few million people were killed under the National Socialist system, which the SS and the Gestapo helped prop up. But we might tell ourselves that Colonel Pushnik wasn't from that generation, and he wasn't even, in a way, even from that organization, because he was from the Foreign Intelligence Service of the SS. And they, in a way, attracted the brightest and the best, and he speaks foreign languages, and he's very efficient. And it's a very refreshing contrast to the shambles in the Reichskanzleramt under Boris Yeltsin. And so we hold our nose, and we think this is probably a change for the better. But then we might feel a little bit differently if Colonel Pushnik then was heard to say in public that the collapse of the Third Reich was the geopolitical catastrophe of the century. And we might feel outright nauseous if he said that the Anschluss and the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia were fully in accordance with international law at the time. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is exactly how the Balts and the Poles and the other Central Europeans and the people in the Balkans feel when they hear former Lieutenant Colonel Vladimir Putin, the President of the Russian Federation, saying that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was legal. That pact, that secret pact between Hitler and Stalin, which was not only the death sentence for those countries of Central and Eastern Europe, but a literal death sentence for millions of their people. And if we were then to read in an official German government newspaper that there were no gas chambers at Auschwitz, I think alarm bells might be beginning to tinkle a bit. Because, ladies and gentlemen, that is how the Poles feel when they read in Rosyjska Gazeta on the 18th of September last year that the Katyn massacre of 20,000 Polish officers killed in cold blood by the NKVD was not, as every scrap of forensic and archival evidence says, the work of the Soviet secret police, but was the Nazis. The classic Soviet Stalinist combination, first the crime and then the lie, being resurrected now, 18 years after Mikhail Gorbachev laid it to rest. Not once, not twice, but 5 times in mainstream Russian media in the last 6 months. Is it any wonder, ladies and gentlemen, that people in Eastern Europe feel a little bit worried about the way things are going? And they look to us for support. And they are pleased because, thank goodness, they're in NATO, and thank goodness they're in the EU. I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, if we hadn't brought those countries into NATO in the 1990s and the early years of this decade, would we be able to do it now? Or would we be experiencing the same contortions that we experience as we try and work out what we can do to help the Georgians, who, as Mr. Pushkov rightly said, 70% want to join NATO, have experienced rocket attacks, have experienced blockades, who experienced deportations from Russia, which have left people dead, people whose only crime was to have a Georgian surname. And we can't work out quite what we can manage to do to help them because the Germans are in bed with the Russians and don't like the idea of NATO expansion anymore. Now let's leave aside all the things that are happening inside Russia. Let's leave aside the criminalization of dissent. Let's leave aside the assassination law, which allows the president to order the murder abroad of anybody who is seen as an enemy of the Russian state. Let's just look at the way in which they use the trade weapon in Eastern Europe. Let's look at the blockade of oil supplies to Latvia and Lithuania, the monopoly of the east-west gas pipelines, which are threatening the energy security of Europe. We tried to build a new pipeline, the EU did. It was called Nabucco, as in freeing the slaves, a subtle reference to the grip which the Kremlin, or rather the gas division of Kremlin Inc., alias Gazprom, has on east-west gas supplies. We failed. Russia has stitched up the Balkans in a new pipeline called South Stream. It should be called Checkmate, because that's where it's left us. The European Union has been humiliated in the field of energy security. During the Cold War, ladies and gentlemen, the Kremlin had 3 aims. It wanted to maintain its dominance in its empire, to divide and disrupt the Atlantic Alliance, and to achieve the Finlandization of Western Europe. It's all going pretty much according to plan. Russia's pushing back hard in its former empire. Not military, I agree with Professor Pushkov on that, but you don't need tanks when you've got banks. It's exploiting divisions over Iraq, Afghanistan and Kosovo missile defense to weaken the alliance between America and Europe, that alliance that won the last Cold War. And it's pushing ahead with Finlandization too. The French, ladies and gentlemen, have a saying, "Cet animal est très méchant. Quand on l'attaque, il se défend." This animal is very wicked. When it's attacked, it defends itself. We should be defending ourselves more. It's a sign of how weakened we've become, that even the feeble efforts that Europe makes to defend itself and defend our allies in Eastern Europe are characterized with such extraordinary leaps of logic and such twists of fact as if it was us and not the Kremlin which is launching the new Cold War.